It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, I have with me my wonderful co-host, Andy Grabner. How are you doing today, Andy?
I'm very good, but Brian, I was expecting a little more enthusiasm. Normally, you are like full of energy, but today you were just like
I was up late. Up late. I had to pick my daughter up from a concert, so I'm a little tired this morning. But if you want, I go like, "Hey, Andy!" See, here's the dumb joke. And so everyone, Andy prepped our guests saying we make some dumb jokes beforehand, and this is the dumb. I don't even know if you can consider it a joke if it's not even like close to making you laugh. So instead of me continuing my failed stand-up career that I never had, Andy, why don't you do some sort of, let's see if you can segue from this mess to, let's see if you can swing us back to the topic at hand.
Yeah, you mean like a pendulum, swinging from something that wasn't that exciting and energetic to something that is extremely exciting and will bring a lot of energy to our listeners. Today's podcast guest is Lesley Cordero. I hope I pronounced the last name correctly. Perfect. I got the thumbs up. Lesley and we happened to meet each other last year in London at dinner with our mutual friend Abby Bankser. And she was at the conference DevOps Con, I believe, in London. I was there for another event, and then Abby said, "Hey, I want to bring a friend. Do you mind?" I said, "Sure." And so we got to talk. And Lesley, here we are a year later. Thank you so much for being a guest on our show today.
Awesome. Yeah, super glad to be here. Thank you for the patience, and really excited to talk about platform engineering.
Yeah, exactly. That's the topic, because I have, thanks for sharing the slides with me. You did a couple of talks. Last year was DevOps Con. I think just recently you were speaking also at QCon. Is this correct?
Yes.
Did I remember this correctly? Yeah.
Yep.
The topics were around, and I just highlight the titles because there's a lot of stuff in there. Driving organizational sustainability with platform engineering was one of your talks, and the other one was called Platform Engineering as a Practice of Sociotechnical Excellence. I looked through your slides. I also had a couple of notes, and the whole kind of, not joke, but the transition that we tried to play earlier with the pendulum. There was one thing you talked about, the pendulum of tension. And I think you can probably explain this much better, but just folks, if you have a chance, we will put all of the links to any presentations of your recordings that are out there on YouTube or on these conference pages. We'll put this into the description of the podcast. Check it out. Also, I'm not sure if we are allowed, can we share the slides as well?
Yeah, some of them are definitely open up for, I'll let you know which ones are.
Perfect. We will also add these links. And I just want to highlight one thing. There's a lot of different things you talk about. You talk about how the importance of bringing organizational change together with technical change in the organization. So don't see them in separation, but do them jointly together. You also talk about leadership. You had an interesting quote from David Ye. You told me earlier how to pronounce it correctly, where he said, it's our jobs as leaders to hold things in tension. And when we talk about tension, you brought up the pendulum of tension. And the pendulum, really, you try not to hold the pendulum in the middle, but you always try to make sure as it moves, let's say, between culture and people versus tools and processes, or from a platform engineering side, where you try to find the balance between developer and operations, or end-user experience and developer experience, that you're steering it correctly, so that I guess it doesn't flip all the way too far in one side. I know I talked a lot, but this is a really exciting topic. Lesley, for those people that have never heard about the sociotechnical excellence that you talked about in platform engineering, what are the couple things that you're highlighting in your presentation? What do people need to know and that also hopefully encourages them to watch some of your presentations.
Yeah, so sociotechnical is definitely a complex topic. It has origins from decades and decades ago from industry research that actually I think happened in UK, which is where I gave the talk, funny enough. Um, but it's basically this idea that you can't look at social and technical systems completely separate, right? Like that they inevitably interact and impact the other, right? And so so socio-technical theory basically relies on this idea of like joint optimization, where when you're trying to change the system, you have to think about both together, right? And like that process of like optimizing for the overall system by looking at at how the social and technical components interact with each other, that's called joint optimization. And to me, that joint optimization, like that's the hard part of like being a leader. Like that's where all the tension, to use David's term, comes from. So I really think of like leadership as like a practice of optimizing that. And especially because there's not as many like playbooks on how to do that, because every single system is like has its own context and whatnot. So socio-technical theory basically has like, it comes with the framework of how to think about those things. It has like 4 components that are part of, that interact together in the social and technical context. And then there's the organizational part can be more external. So there's a lot of external factors, right? Like, for example, in my talk, I speak to the impact of the overall like economic situation that we're in right now, right? Like that is why we had to do a lot of mass layoffs, right? Like that's why there's been a pressure to be lean and, more than even before. And so those are the things that are more out of our control. But socio-technical theory is basically talking about how do you go about making internal change in light of your external and internal constraints. And so I basically talk about how platform engineering is that practice of socio-technical, of navigating socio-technical tensions.
Do you see one thing that came to mind? We see a lot of organizations that say, hey, we need to replace this particular tool with the next generation tool because then everything will be better. Then they do it, and then they realize after 3 years when the contract is up for renewal, wait, actually, they didn't get the value out of it. Because I guess to your point, if you only replace a tool with another tool, but don't figure out how all of this fits correctly and jointly optimize it with the rest of the organization, then in the end, we will have a failed investment, I guess, right? Because that's why so many people are frustrated. Years and years, there's a new tool coming in and yet another tool. But in the end, they feel like nothing changes.
Yeah. I think, that's a great example. Tools are not silver bullets, right? I think that's really what a lot of it comes down to. Because, I think in observability, which, I hear you guys are familiar with, right? It's not just about like the tools and whatnot that you adopt, right? It's also about getting people to actually understand like telemetry, for example, right?
Yeah.
And so if you just migrate to a different tool, right, it doesn't matter if your engineers fundamentally still don't understand how to like actually navigate their telemetry. And sure, tools can have trade-offs on like, well, how easy they make it so that, your developers can understand it, right? But at the end of the day, right, there needs to be that social investment as well, right? So we can't just expect to introduce a new tool without like overlying or underlying support systems and whatnot, right? So when I'm thinking about, adopting anything new, I'm also thinking about how do we go about it from a social like process, right? Like how do we socialize the skills needed? How do we, through education, also looking at our current gaps, right? Like is the tool if we're evaluating our current tool, right? Is it not working because of its tool limitations, or is it because of like the educational factors and whatnot? I think that's like a great example of how important it is to consider both the like social and technical parts of trying to solve a problem, such as like understanding your systems.
So Lesley, another thing that I had in mind is because you said in the current economical situation that we're in, this is kind of puts a lot of pressure on a lot of organizations where you now need to rethink how you do things. And my question now is this something that you typically see, that it takes external events that you cannot control to have organizations think about how they need to change things? Or are there other ways to go about this and not just wait for the next economical depression?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency for leaders to be reactionary, right? So responding to like external stimuli that's not in your control. And I think like the best leaders are those who can be more proactive, right? Even preventative, right? Obviously, you can't prevent all your issues from happening, right? Like at the end, that's sort of by definition what it is, right? Like it's out of your control. But I do think, as an example with like hiring and whatnot, right? A lot of times, a lot of the reason why this was such a huge shock for the industry, I think, is because we were so used to like overhiring and like not leaning on efficiency and whatnot, right? And that we waited till the moment that things got really bad to like really introspect on like, are we using our time wisely, right? But I think those leaders who were already thinking that way, right, like felt the impact a lot less, right? Because they were already in the business of being efficient, right? So one of the things I emphasize is that like this, the recent changes in terms of like, increasingly emphasizing leaning, right, and lean movements and whatnot, that's like not actually anything new, right? But I think now we're just having a more shock, like, hey, we actually meant it when we were saying those things. So I think like most leaders are in a more of a reactionary way of thinking, but I think the leaders who can get themselves to think more proactively are the ones who like are most set up for success during those hard times of like change.
Yeah. I think it almost feels like I have another kind of analogy. Earlier I talked about these tools, replacing one tool with the other doesn't really help you if you don't think about how to also change the processes. Yeah. In software engineering or in testing, we often talk about chaos engineering, right? Mm-hmm. So basically forcing chaos on your system to see how it behaves and then optimize it. Could we say that if you constantly run chaos experiments against your organizations, you will be more resilient later on when actually really disaster strikes from the outside?
Actually, it's so funny. I keep putting off writing a talk about how to handle organizational incidents. And I feel like the chaos engineering analogy is one that I like has been sort of floating on the back of my mind, right? Where like an organizational like a good example of how it could be an organizational incident is like someone leaves suddenly. Right? Like that's an organizational incident, or at least an incident to your team, right? Imagine like, that people call it bus factor, which is a little dark. But that's very real, right? Like people leave, people have drastic changes in their life that suddenly, they have to go on. I mean, personally speaking, right? Like last year I had to go on leave for a bit because I had some personal issues happen, right? And like, to me, I always say like I can tell how good or not good at my job, so to speak, I am, but based on how my team reacts to my absence, right? And so, I definitely think there are ways of sort of there are creative ways of testing like your organizational resilience. And I think it's definitely like I think the absence of leadership is a good one, right? And it's not to say like you should just like ditch your team sort of a thing, right? But there's something to be said about a team that is still resilient in the absence of their leader, right? So and like I think I love the chaos engineering analogy, so I'm like lighting up just hearing about it.
Without giving away any information really about Dynatrace, one thing I can probably say is that I think we are proactive in those sides. Especially, several years ago when there were tons of tech layoffs. We didn't have tech layoffs because we were always very cognizant of our size. I know within the last year or two, in my organization, within the company, there's been a lot of encouragement for leaders to have new hires lined up right? Are you talking to people? Have you identified future people you want to hire? Are you starting to mentor them and train them up for exactly that bus thing, right? If something goes on and we need to replace someone, are we starting from scratch? Or do we have people that we know we're going to be going to see if we can move them up? So back to Andy's first question about either, being proactive versus, not being proactive and just being reactive, I guess. It's not something I really thought of it in those terms, but it's definitely comforting to know that we've got some of that going on. Next thing I'll have to do though is schedule a month vacation on my team, and it'll just be a test for them. So.
Hey, Lesley, I guess we completely skipped the introduction part on where you can say, I'm Lesley, I work as a staff engineer at the New York Times, right? We completely skipped that. So you do work for the New York Times, and you mentioned earlier that your team handled it pretty well, even though you were not there for a little while. Do you have any insights on what you did or what the team did to make it resilient? Any additional tips and tricks, best practices?
Yeah, so I mean, I left during honestly a pretty chaotic time. It was freshly after a major election moment, and I think the thing that set up my team for success, because we did, the general election did go well. Which is definitely a huge accomplishment. We didn't experience any major downtime. And that was the first time I think in quite a while that we had that milestone. So, and I think a lot of it did go down to just thoughtful planning. I put a lot of effort into the general election readiness preparation plans. I was leading it up before I went on leave, and I think that was ultimately what set my team up for success. I started thinking about that. I knew it was coming up, and I started thinking about it proactively from very early on, before even the wider news organization told us, hey, it is now time to prepare for the general election. It was something I was thinking about since earlier 2023, and the official kickoff for it wasn't until August, right? So I think it was that upfront thinking that I did that honestly set us for success in that regard, because not only was it, and it was also helpful for myself and my team, but also leadership and whatnot. When I had to step away, they knew what needed to get done based off of the plans I had laid out and whatnot. And I had already spent a lot of time socializing them as well. So I think a lot of it has to do with sharing information. Very frankly, don't keep things to yourself. Because then that creates sort of the silos that we talk about in DevOps and whatnot. So I think for me, I try really hard to lean into that information sharing, whether that's through documentation, whether that's through having, one-on-ones with, or meetings, recurring meetings with my stakeholders and peers. So that way I'm not a singular point of, information and therefore failure. I think if someone can leave your organization and you feel that feeling of oh crap, what do we do? That's something to pay attention to and address pretty immediately. So I think it was a lot of those combination of things. And it wasn't, I think it was a couple years of just me making sure there's redundancy on anything that I have to provide. And obviously, everyone has their own uniqueness to contribute, right? And I don't want to say this in a make everyone replaceable or anything. But I think I think if you can reframe it as we're trying to help each other grow constantly, right? Through information sharing, through teaching, through knowledge sharing, et cetera. That's where I think a lot of beauty can happen, so to speak, with respect to the kind of work we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's resiliency planning for the human side.
Yes.
Yes. If something falls over, are you if we think about three, older architecture, are you the database, or are you one of many services that, okay, we can limp on by and figure out a way, but we're not completely out of luck, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It also, Brian, it just reminded me about the previous podcast we recorded with Lisa Carlin Curtis. She is a also a founding engineer at Incidents.io, and she was talking about the importance of sharing, the importance. She was talking about how important it is to embrace incidents and to be open about it, and document them, share them, because the worst incident is actually the one that you're solving without anybody knowing, because then nobody can learn from it. And if you're then gone, then nobody had this previous experience. And I think that was kind of falls in line with what you just said, right? Like preparing and sharing and documenting. Coming back to platform engineering, I know you're officially listed as a staff engineer at the New York Times. Are you part of a platform engineering team, or how does why? Yeah, it seems like you're nodding. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit on how you're organized and what platform engineering means for you and your team?
Yeah. So save the fact that we've had some reorgs in the last year. But I've always been part of the platform engineering organization in my current role. So originally we called ourselves delivery engineering, and which was basically platform engineering, but we hadn't quite like really leaned into the label yet. But that encompassed, and it mostly encompassed infrastructure platforms, which I do always name as like an anti-pattern, if I'm being honest. Now we have addressed that, so actually now we're more fully encompassing on the entire sort of like developer experience. So now our like most recent reorg essentially is like covering even like full stack development, right? So which is awesome. Like we're still figuring things out. I think my leadership is going to kill it in terms of like having a greater like platform engineering story. So it's a really exciting time to work in my organization. So for us, platform engineering, it is ultimately about the internal developer experience, right? But we're like not just viewing it from the infrastructure side these days. So traditionally we had just been mostly focused on infrastructure. So we have like our shared infrastructure platforms and whatnot, but now we're also talking about like shared tooling, right? Not just for infrastructure, like also our runtime language stories, right? Like, so we standardize on like Go and TypeScript, Python. So we're really thinking about like those experiences, even like holistically across different parts of the team. So we've grown a lot in the last like 6 months, especially. So a lot of unknown territory, but super exciting to just kind of like really also talk about what platform engineering means, because I think that like platform engineering is equal to infrastructure platform is like something we're really like not. It's so ingrained, I think, in like the platform engineering org, but I really don't see it that way. So I think it's really exciting that the Times is sort of taking that more like wider picture of platform engineering. I specifically sit under reliability platforms. So we're focused on the like reliability experience. But there's other platform teams like for developer experience and whatnot. And like I really distinguish us from like those types of teams. It's like we focus more on the like service sort of like experience, like a singular service, like what's the best practices for a service. What tools do they need to actually like build services, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's some of like what's going on at the Times.
So we could say the Times is with the Times on platform engineering?
I hope so. I would like to think so. So it keeps me here.
Yeah.
Did you, coming back to that pendulum, when you decided to standardize on certain runtimes, because you mentioned Go is your runtime of choice, who made that decision? And how did you come up with that decision?
Yeah. That decision wasn't, I can't take credit for that one. That's for sure. Actually, one of my colleagues, her name is Sarah Duncan. She's awesome. She was a huge like spearhead of technical standards at the Times. And like, honestly, I came in and she had already laid down a decent groundwork, and like she and I just kind of kept forward with it alongside, other people who, of course, wasn't just us two. But yeah, so that decision, it came to be in a more like grassroots consensus kind of a way, which I am happy to talk about the like pros and cons of that. But yeah, so it sort of started out of this. It was like the first major standard that was put together at the Times that was like organizational wide and like more in the governance sort of side of things, which like in enterprises, I think like governance is a huge part of what platform engineering is.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was sort of the history behind that. And there was a lot of opinions that went into like that for sure, especially because we had a history of a lot of drift. The Times is an extremely old organization. It's like 170 something years old.
Mhm.
So, we've been doing technology since way before Google even existed, for example. And so, there was Cobalt there. There was like everything you can think of possibly, which is what makes it also an exciting job. But, but then going on to our defining standards is a lot harder just because we have to go through so much drift and really consolidate like what do we want the developer experience story to be at the times.
Mhm.
So yeah, let me know if there's anything in there you want me to really
Yeah,
elaborate
no, I
on.
would love to, because I hope you did you involve your internal customers, your developers in that decision process?
Yes, for sure. And that's
Mm.
like something I really love to push is the, inclusion of developers. And Sarah was actually the person I mentioned. She's actually a product engineer.
Mhm.
And I think the like product platform combo is like definitely very powerful. I talk about that in the talk I gave at QCon, like that pendulum between
Mhm.
product and platform. And I like my personal opinion is that the folks who have been in both roles are often like particularly strong in platform engineering because they have both perspectives. So I think like her and I like brought that perspective together for sure, alongside some other like awesome coworkers. Like I don't know if you know Ahmed Bebars. Do you know? He speaks a lot in the Kubernetes circles and whatnot.
Yeah. No, I met
Yeah.
him last 2 weeks ago
Okay.
in London.
Oh,
Yeah. And
awesome.
actually, we talked about this topic, and now I just put it up here. It's
Ah,
my
yes.
Yeah, because we wrote a book on platform engineering, and the subtagline line is crafting modern platforms as a product. And that's
Cool.
why I wanted to ask you if you have included your end users in
Yeah.
the decision process of how
Yes.
you craft that platform and product. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. No, I think there were, I met a couple of people from the Times in London. Just
Nice.
so many people and faces and names that
Yeah.
sometimes it's a little hard when you just mention a name. Do you know him? And yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the Can you tell us also a little bit about, and this is for me always the biggest question that comes up when I talk about platform engineering is how, or have you found a way to measure the impact that you have with your work? And do you also then and how can you justify the number of people, the time and the money you put in? But I think the question can be answered with, do you have a way to measure the impact, or did you lay out a goal in the beginning and then you said, now we are working towards that goal?
Yeah, yes, that's a huge topic in platform engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah, measurement is really difficult, right? Like there's a lot of, I mean, my thought process behind how to measure success is that usually you need multiple frameworks, right? And like a lot of the like science of it is sort of going across those different frameworks and seeing like trying to gather insights, right? I think the like having only one metric or even just like one set of metrics can often be like a downfall of platform engineering. Like if we over-index on DORA metrics or if we over-index on like adoption, right? Or if we over-index on like service, level objectives, right? And those are probably the three most common that I think like we tend to rely on, or I see other organizations rely on. Yeah, I think as someone in SRE, reliability platforms, SLOs are definitely like some of the metrics that I like to spearhead, if only because I think
Mhm.
it ties it to the end user experience a lot more cleanly.
Mhm.
But I think, like I said, the combination of different frameworks is like really where the magic happens. So we also use DORA metrics. Adoption is definitely a huge part of it for us too, right? Like as a more specific example, right? We're a tracing first organization.
Mhm.
So super huge for us. And one thing that we do track is literally like the number of services that have tracing and integrated into it. So those are sort of some examples of it. Adoption of our shared platforms, And there's also the difficult part there is also figuring out the like total market and whatnot, which is something that our product leaders have really taken a dive into and are figuring out. It's super cool to like see unravel, which is just the idea of like, okay, given like what is the actual market of like adoption that we can have, right? So number of services is going to be like an important part of that, right? That's kind of one of the main like single units that we're working with, also like teams. And it kind of, it depends on the context of what you're trying to drive and adopt. But yeah, but in general, it's definitely very difficult. And I think like there's not as many, the best practices aren't as ironed out.
I liked it that I had the exactly same discussion with somebody at KubeCon, and I said, before you start a platform, before you go down that road, first do market research, internal market research. Do you even have an addressable market within your organization, or are you still too small where it doesn't make sense yet to bring up a new quote unquote product that you then need to sell to your internal developers? So do market research. What are their pains? How can you quantify the pain points right now, and how would you solve it, and how would you make this pain go away, and how can you then also prove that you really had an impact? Yeah. I like it that you call it the addressable markets. That's really nice.
Yeah. Not my term. It's our product people came up with it.
Okay. But in the end, it's kind of classical product engineering.
Yeah.
Right. Because if the three of us would have an idea now for a new product, whatever product that is, before we start coding, we first would do some research and saying, how many people have this problem that we're addressing? Because if it's only 2 people in the world and we would charge $20, then I guess, doesn't make sense. Yeah. But so I think this whole idea of you want to build a product, but before you start building, you first need to figure out, does it even make sense? Right. Is there, now looking back at your talks that you gave and also the recent one in London at QCon, is there anything else in those talks that we haven't talked about today in the podcast where you say, hey, this is something that I want to make sure people just know and understand and take away from my talk?
I mean, so in my talk, I speak to like the power of community quite a lot. And, I think community is the word that gets thrown around a lot, right? So it's hard to like figure out like what is community, like, especially in this like work context and whatnot. But it is something that I do really try to drive in all my talks, is the idea that like, and I think it ties back to where we started, right? The idea that you can't think about the technical components without the social components, so yeah, I think that would be probably the main thing I would want to leave people away with, is just the idea of like thinking about the impact of the work that you do, both on terms of like our technical systems, but also in terms of how it impacts other people, whether it's like your product end users or the way that, or your coworkers, right? Platform engineering is kind of interesting because like your coworkers are your end users, or your users rather. So yeah, I think it's just like using that framework, I think across like multiple contexts, not just like, not just like customers or,
Yeah. Do you have an internal, I don't know, a community of practice and mentorship program? Do you have regular internal meetups, or how does this work within the Times?
Yeah. So we do have community of practices. So a lot of like our standards come out of there actually. So I really like to leverage those communities because one, they tend to be passionate about the technology too, right? So it's like, I think like motivation is very rare and like expensive to cultivate. And so I really just like, I think that's like where a lot of opportunity for good work comes from. So definitely love to like leverage like internal communities and whatnot. I think like it's hard. I mean, the difficulty there, right, is like just sustaining them. Like that's the thing I think I've seen organizations struggle with, is just like sustaining those communities, especially because they can be a lot of almost like extracurricular kind of work, right? But like also they've been super like essential to some of the work I've done in platform engineering with driving adoption, right? Like those are where I get a lot of my like technology champions, right? It was I'm building, so for example, I built a hotel-based Node.js library, right? And like I couldn't have done that with a lot of the folks that I met in the like TypeScript web community of practice. So definitely having those like institutionalizing things like that, I think is super important because it not only provides, what it's providing, but it also communicates like an importance of that kind of work, right? Whether it's mentorship or, community of learning, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. I got two final questions for you. The first question is more an organizational question. Why does let's phrase it in a different way. I hear a lot of people at conferences and they say, well, our company would never allow us to be on stage and talk about things we do internally. Why does the New York Times allow you and your colleagues to publicly talk about what you are doing internally? And may your answer be an encouragement to all the leaders out there in organizations that currently don't allow their engineers to speak?
Yeah, great question. I think, to be fair, the Times we definitely have our processes for like getting things approved and whatnot. And I think a lot of it's though because they want to give us, the freedom to share knowledge and like also, these are opportunities for us to like grow as well. Like every time I go to a conference, like I'm meeting people and learning a ton, right? It's not just like a one-way transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Like I definitely get a lot out of it too. Yeah, and I think it's not as surprising also when you think about like what we're in the business of, right? Like sharing information. Like our mission is to like help people better understand the world, right? And like that applies to the technical and engineering world, right? So I think like that sharing, while we have to be careful with it, because some things can be, sensitive and whatnot, the general election stuff I, talked about. It's easier to talk about now that it did pass, right? But, I think in general, like we like to shed ourselves as like leaders of information sharing. And I think this is just kind of one example of our wider mission.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully, so whoever now feels themselves hopefully more motivated to let your people present at a conference. It's a great way to not only share your experience, but then also learn, because what I hear is, right, or what I see is the more you share, the more people are willing to share. Mm-hmm. And they come to you with the problems that they have, or also with some of the solutions that they have, which then helps you to then figure out how you can solve certain things that you've struggled with in the past. Brings me to my final question. So it's as of the time of the recording, it's May. Not May. Well, the time of the recording is April. The time this air will be May 2025. In a year from now, I assume you will be back at the next DevOps Con or QCon or whatever conference it is. What will be the topic about? Any thoughts on what's the next big thing?
Yeah, I think a bigger focus on enterprises. It's all enterprise organizations are always a theme, I think, of like how I approach my talks, because I have a lot of enterprise experience. But as maybe a spoiler alert, I have some upcoming work where enterprise will be a huge part of the focus. So I suspect that it'll influence my talks as well.
Well, thanks, Lesley. I'm looking forward to seeing all the new content that is coming out. We're not spoiling any beans, but it's really exciting on the stuff that you just told us off record. But no, seriously, I hope I also get a chance to see you at some point again in person, whether it's over dinner or watching you on stage, giving a talk. Folks, make sure that you are checking out all of the links in the podcast summary, whether it's the existing presentations. If it's okay, Lesley, we also put in your LinkedIn contact so that people can connect with you and follow up with you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Really exciting. Brian, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, well, it's funny because we've been doing some platform engineering talks a few episodes ago, and now we've swung back to it. Hey, there's another pendulum. But the the sociotechnical side, I think, is kind of a new concept. I mean, not really a new concept in practice, but calling it out as something to do, right? I mean, you could take a look at, podcasts like this or other ones that are doing this, or all the talks at the conference as one level of speaking about benefits, adoption, and how things are working out for people. But the part that you highlighted that I feel is missing for most organizations is getting the internal buy-in, right? Thinking about the people who are going to be using these, making sure it's going to fit their needs, right? Too often we see either top-down approaches to this is what our new setup or platform is going to be, or these are the new tools, or it might just even be a smaller group of people picking out for a larger, and they're not, I work in pre-sales on this. I can't think of times when we have conversations about the wider organization who might be using our tool, what their preferences are, what their needs are. Not just, we talk about that with the group we're with, but if that group is making it, like, a lot of the people we're selling to aren't necessarily thinking about reaching out to the broader team to find that out, to make sure everything is going to be good. And it's, I hadn't thought about it before, but obviously that's super important, right? Because you want to make sure all your developers, your operations, your SREs, everybody who's going to be doing all this stuff is going to be happy and encouraged to use that, right? And it doesn't just stop when you're thinking about it and having those conversations. It continues where once you do put in a new process or platform or tool in place, continually internalizing, sharing the wins, sharing successes, sharing pitfalls to avoid, so that it's that sharing of knowledge, right? Which you're doing at conferences and all that. That's going to keep people interested in it. And I just don't know how much that's being thought of. So the fact that you said there's I guess even studies around it and all, right, is brand new to me. And that's kind of fascinating. I was a communication major in college, right? So I was more on the liberal arts side of things, and how things work, and it fits in to that side. So very, very fascinating ideas and topics, and it's really cool to see that it's being thought of, even though I hadn't known about it. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, of course. It was great chatting with you both.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And this is the Technically Andy, the first podcast of our 11th year. So we've been doing this for 11 years, if you can believe it. So, and thanks for everyone who's been with us all this time. And we keep on learning from people like you, who are gracious enough to come on to our show. And we can't do it without guests like you. So thank you so much, Lesley. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.